please welcome to the virtual stage, Nicholas and possibly Zachary.
Yep.
All right, thank you.
All right. Hello, this is Nicholas and Zach presenting virtually from Toronto. We are Chrome engineers on the web identity team, and we will be talking about multiple identity provider support on the FedCM API. Chrome's current plan is to phase out third-party cookies in the third quarter of 2024, which is the third quarter of next year. Although phasing out third-party cookies is a step in the right direction for user privacy, it breaks identity federation cases that are dependent on third-party cookies. For example, relying parties, or in short RP, such as the New York Times, rely on identity providers, or in short IDP, such as Google, to allow the user to log in without requiring a new username and password. FedCM is an API that enables these types of federated login without third-party cookies in a privacy-preserving way. It was shipped in M108, but it only supports a single identity provider at a time. The single IDP can be any provider who supports FedCM, such as Google. The website which calls FedCM, such as Pinterest, is referred to as the RP, or the relying party. Currently, there are many identity providers in the world, and a user can have multiple identities on the web. So it is important that we do not limit the FedCM UI to only one IDP at a time. This is an illustrative mock of how multi-IDP support on the FedCM API could look like. In this mock, Elisa Beckett has an active web session with Apple and Google, but they can also choose to use other IDPs or accounts. Now, Nicholas will talk about our API.
All right, so yeah, this is how the current API shape looks like. It is a JavaScript method, navigator.credentials.get, and it receives some dictionary parameters, including an array of providers. Inside that array, each element of that array contains the config URL of the provider, as well as some other information about the identity provider that the relying party wants to use in this FedCM invocation. Now, the problem is that we want to allow IDPs to work independently when we ship multi-IDP support. In particular, we want RPs to be able to embed IDP SDKs. Basically, from each IDP, they can have a different SDK. They can just embed it, and ideally we would want that to just magically work. And if basically the RP enables some option to use FedCM with multiple IDPs, then those IDPs which support FedCM would show together on the browser UI, which you saw earlier, which is the FedCM UI for federated login. Now, that means that it would be tough to have the IDPs all be together in the same GET call, right? Because that would mean that they would somehow have to coordinate for all of them to be shown in the same GET call. It would be a bit tricky. Basically, might require the relying party itself to make that call independently, which is not how the current FedCM invocations usually work when the relying party embeds the identity provider SDK. So that would be a bit of an issue in terms of adoption, at least for the particular scenario where the RPs are expected to do almost nothing and get multiple identity providers for free. In addition, we also have an issue when presenting multiple IDPs as the browser, because the relying party or RP may have some preference about which IDP it is that they prefer. So, for example, if they have like 3 IDPs, but the RP says, well, if the user has an account with IDP 1, then please try to like surface that one more prominently because I prefer to engage with that IDP. Then the browser should be able to respect that choice from the RP. So keep that problem in mind as I go through the solutions. Now, the first solution that we have thought about is just extending providers. Right now, as I mentioned, it's an array, but we only support an array of size 1. So the simplest solution is to extend that array to support more than one identity provider. So something like what you are seeing in the slide, where you have multiple descriptions corresponding to multiple different identity providers within the same GET call. Now, as I mentioned, that has some benefits. So first benefit, there's no heuristics involved. You will see some of those later. Second benefit, it's relatively easy to understand what's going on, right? It's still a single navigator.credentials.get call. The developer understands what's going to happen and so on. Third benefit, the relying party can specify some preference for the IDPs very easily. For example, it can be as simple as the order in which the IDPs show up in the providers array can be the implied preference from the relying party. However, this has a very important con, which is that it would require the IDPs to collaborate between each other, right? Since in this case, essentially they would have to pass all of that data, the config, the client, maybe some other data involving the call to the RP, which would then have to figure out how to do the GET call by themselves. So that's the main con, is that we do not get the nice property that the RPs can just embed multiple IDP SDKs and get FedCM from those multiple sources for free. Now, the second solution we have in mind is to wait until a certain point in time. Basically, wait, for example, until unload. And once unload arrives, we're like, okay, these are all the GET calls that have been invoked so far. We fetch all the needed information from all the IDPs corresponding to those GET calls, and we create the unified UI in the browser, which includes all of the IDPs which called GET before that point in time, in this case, unload. If it's after unload, it could be simpler, like wait for the next task and then have that be the cutoff or something like that. But unload is, a page load is generally the harder problem. So if we think about FedCM being invoked during page load, then we can think of unload or some other specific point in time as the cutoff. And then the browser will take it from there. The problem with this, well, the benefit of this first is that it does not require IDPs to collaborate like the initial solution, but it does have problems. So first of all, it relies on heuristics, which are potentially unpredictable and hard to understand for developers. So that may result in certain differences in the behavior depending on the timing. And also there may be performance issues in terms of when the FedCM UI is shown, right? As we know, unload can take forever to fire for some pages. And well, you can be pretty much guaranteed that whatever point in time we pick, there will be some concerns about, well, the FedCM UI is taking too long to show for certain pages. So that is also a big issue. Now, another thing that I would note is that for when the RP wants to specify a preference for IDPs, solution 1 has already a simple solution to that, but maybe solution 2 doesn't, because we're assuming the RPs just embed the IDP SDKs independently. So some brainstorming for that particular problem. One option is to have a new JavaScript method to state the ordering of the IDPs. Another option is to use the ordering in which the RP embeds IDP as the case as the heuristic, although, of course, that may fail in cases where the RP actually just invokes get directly, then it's unclear what we would do. And another option is to basically order based on how fast the IDPs return the accounts. So performance-based, but that's really not providing any RP control. So it's not really a solution to the specific RP preference problem. Now, the next solution that we have in mind is to dynamically update the UI. So you can see the example on the left, the mock is showing some account which was received initially, but then the other IDP replies with another account. Then we update the FedCM UI so that it also shows that new account, and then we can do that until basically all the IDPs have returned their accounts. So the benefit of this is that it still doesn't require IDP and RP collaboration. It's also easy to understand, and depending on how you do it, it might encourage IDPs to make sure that they are returning their accounts promptly so that they show quickly in the FedCM UI. However, there are some also issues with this. One is that the UI might shift for the user, depending on how different the performance of IDPs is. This may or may not be a huge issue. And of course, we would have to protect the account because the accounts are clickable, right? You can select an account. So we would have to protect the accounts when any shifting occurs, just to make sure that the user doesn't accidentally select an account they didn't want to select. But we already do that in any case for when we initially show the UI. And additionally, the other potential problem is that we still want returning accounts to show at the top. So because of that property, we might need to reorder accounts more than we would like. For example, if first IDP returns an account that hasn't been used with FedCM before, but the second IDP returns one that has been used, then we would want to show that one more prominently. So that would require reshuffling all of the accounts. And another solution, the last one, but it has two slightly different flavors, is what we call IDP registration. So in this solution, the IDP first invokes a simple register method to notify the user agent that it is going to use FedCM, and later it actually invokes FedCM with the get call. So you can see the code is kind of just adding a register method and then having two separate get calls. Now, this solution does not require IDPs to collaborate, but it does require the RP to get involved, right? Because they will have to basically manually tell the IDPs when to invoke what and so on. It is also not great in the sense that it is backwards incompatible with the existing API we have shipped, right? Because we currently do not have the identity provider .register method. And it sort of moves the waiting problem to a different method, which in this case is the register method. So it's unclear how much it really is solving. That said, with this method, if the RP has control on the order in which register is called, then it does provide the RP with some preference, with some way to specify IDP ordering. Now, lastly, the final solution is a similar IDP registration, but in this case, the IDP is only call register, and then the RP essentially will need to figure out when to call get. And it will just say, okay, call get with the providers that have registered up until this point in time. So the register might actually look a bit more involved, right? Because we do require the parameters to be in the register in this case. But essentially, it is another flavor of IDP registration where instead of multiple get calls, you just have one at the end after all the registers have been called. Now, the pro of this, well, first of all, it does allow the RP to specify preference for IDPs. And it sort of solves the waiting problem by passing it on to the RP to figure it out, basically. But again, this is backwards incompatible as well. Well, potentially, because you could still, in theory, call get with non-registered providers, but then that's kind of it becomes a bit tricky, right? The other downside of this solution is that the single get requires complex handling, right? Because that token may be from the first IDP or it may be from the second IDP, right? So you would have to be like, okay, figure out which is the IDP that this token belongs to, right? Which federated account was used, and then pass the token to the relevant IDP. So it puts a lot of work onto the RP. So that's a big downside of this final solution. So we went over the presentation relatively quickly to have some time left for questions or any additional ideas that people have to solve this problem or any other comments. So thank you.
Okay, we have an audience question.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned this maybe in a past CG call, but have you considered a auction worklet-like mechanism where the relying party could provide a script which may have knowledge about, hey, here's the IDPs I'm going to use, here's how I want to rank them. I could get signals like, Google Auth had a logged in account, but Microsoft didn't, so I'd like to prefer the Google one, or just customize it, however it deems is appropriate. Have you evaluated that? Too complex, or are there other obvious downsides?
Sorry, I don't follow. How is that different from the IDP registration option that we mentioned?
So you mentioned a lot of different heuristics or preferences the browser might have in terms of, there could be layout shift, preferring accounts that are already signed in. But if I'm in RP that integrates a lot of different IDPs, I may have very specific preferences about how I want those signals to be taken into account. And obviously the RP shouldn't get to see all this information, but similar to a protected audience API auction, you could consider a worklet that can receive the signals, but not actually, kind of post message or tell itself about it at all. So that's the high level concept. And it sounds like maybe I should write it down and post on the FedCM GitHub, if that wouldn't be helpful.
Yeah, for sure. I can or ping me and I can send you the issue where it would be great to have that idea, because I think it's a little complex, and I'm not sure I'm understanding, but I think it's some flavor of IDP registration, if I understand correctly. But yeah, the details do matter, so yeah, feel free to comment there as well. Thanks.
Yeah, and probably one additional comment. I think your suggestion had something along the lines of having the RP to specify a bunch of the things, but the trend that the operating assumption that FedCM operates on is that we don't want a lot of the work to be put on the RP if we can put it on the IDP, because it's just a lot harder to change what RPs do rather than if the IDP itself does all the changes on their end and it works magically for the RP with the existing SDK that's preferred. But yeah, definitely follow bug and let us know in detail your suggestion. I hope that helps.
Marvin's question.
There's a few other options that you could consider about providing timeouts or default timeouts with options or methods that explicitly take the result of a promise.all, or changing the parameters that you send in to change the shape of the return value. I'd be happy to explore those with you. But if you're not already talking to the W3C tag, that's kind of their job. You can reach out by filing an issue with them. If you've got an explainer that talks about some of these options, that might be a good way to engage. Otherwise, feel free to ping Eric and myself. Thanks.
Can you remind us who is myself? We can't see.
That's Alex
Yeah.
Russell from Microsoft.
I see.
Yeah, we see an empty screen, which is a bit awkward to talk to the podium, but unfortunately, I guess you don't have cameras for the other side. So yeah, just present yourself if you are giving a comment or question, so we know who we're talking to. Thanks.
Anyone else? Okay. Sounds like that's about it, guys.